Welcome to this video in which we're going to discuss musical notation in Braille. The importance of writing music and some of the problems encountered in music Braille as compared with traditional musical notation. Why write music? Although learning by ear is fine in the early stages, the ability to read and write music is essential for serious musical study, and this is just as true for the blind musician as for the sighted. To this end, there is a Braille music notation based on the same 64 signs as are used for literary texts. The Braille method is not only able to represent traditional musical texts, but it can also be used to notate modern music up to the present day. There are many differences between Braille writing and traditional music notation. The first of these is that traditional notation is a graphic representation in which the position of symbols on the musical staff conveys information. Braille notation has to represent all of this information through text written in a linear form, one character after another in a line. Braille music notation can notate anything that might be written in traditional notation, but often, for educational purposes, a score will be simplified when it is transcribed into Braille. Using a Braille score, a blind teacher can teach a sighted student, and a blind student can study a piece of music with a sighted teacher. Music and language. Music may be compared with language in the sense that one can speak a language, but to master it fully, one has also to learn to read and write it. Similarly, music can be learnt by ear, but to master it properly, one also has to learn to read and write it. Being able to read and write in a language makes it easier to express one's thinking, and there is the possibility of proofreading and correcting. It allows you to create and recreate, and reading a text enables us to apprehend the structure of someone's thoughts more clearly than if we simply heard them spoken. Characteristics of traditional musical notation. The traditional musical notation used by sighted people graphically represents the elements of music, such as the structure of the piece, melodic pattern, monophony, polyphony, rhythmic patterns, and many other elements essential for the proper interpretation of a piece. With traditional musical notation, the reader can quickly get an idea of the piece from a cursory glance through the score. By comparison, a Braille music score is like a city without windows or shop signs. Houses, monuments, public places are all there, but we only recognize them when we get to them and touch them. Every sign in the score is placed one next to the other without any apparent hierarchy. It's impossible to glance through a Braille score in the way that a sighted reader can quickly look through a traditionally notated score. Braille notation signs are identical to those that represent the letters of the alphabet and numbers. There is no way to distinguish long notes, rests and chords in the equivalent of a glance, that is to say by moving the finger quickly over the page. It is necessary every time to make an analytical reading of all the signs. No signs may be skipped if the reader is to make sense of the music. A traditionally notated score visually represents the pitch of the notes. The higher notes are positioned higher on the staff, while the lower notes are lower on the staff. A Braille score, however, doesn't give any such idea, so it's a sort of black box. Conventional music is represented in a two-dimensional graphical form, and it should be read both horizontally and vertically. In some cases, signs are able to provide additional information. Braille music is linear and sequential, which means that each of the elements of the music must be notated in a precise sequence one after another, even if musically they occur simultaneously, as for example with chords, as shown in this example. Here, for example, is a simple major scale starting from middle C and ascending to the C an octave above, and then descending back to middle C. To understand the melodic shape of this musical fragment took just a couple of seconds. Symbols other than the notes were ignored as the eye took in the basic shape of the melody, and probably also the fact that the notes were all quavers. Further inspection of this passage would start to take account of other signs, such as the fingering, articulation, phrasing and pedalling. The same example is shown below in Braille, but here it is impossible to ignore some signs in the first reading. One must read every sign in the text before it emerges that what is notated is just a simple ascending and descending scale. In the Braille text, the signs representing the notes are interspersed with all the other symbols, fingering, articulation, phrasing and pedalling in the text. So a quick read to understand the important elements of the melodic character of a musical passage simply isn't possible with the Braille system. There is also the problem that since none of the information can be filtered out and ignored, it may take several readings to assimilate the musical information, only to find that this passage is nothing but a simple scale. Here is the same musical passage. In the top part of the picture we see once again the scale in traditional notation. Once again the melody shape can be read at a glance. In the lower part we have coloured in yellow all the Braille characters that represent other elements apart from the notes, but which unfortunately still have to be read due to the linear nature of the Braille representation. The most obvious solution would be to have the Braille musical text made in various resolutions, from the most simple, with just the notes, and then gradually adding more and more elements such as fingering, articulation, phrasing and pedalling. This example is very significant because after eliminating all of the elements apart from the notes, the text is reduced by more than half. Unfortunately, you can't obtain these kinds of progressively stripped down scores in hard copy. It would be, however, possible if the score were in electronic form, although only if the score were not simply a Braille text file, but rather a file in which the Braille text is contextualized and all of the elements of musical content were marked. The Braille music system is certainly challenging. It can seem long-winded, complex and rather difficult to manage, but at present it is the only way for a blind person to study music rigorously. So let's try to read the following passage. The sighted reader immediately sees that this is a dyad, that is to say a two-note chord. As always, the sense of sight has allowed us to select the most significant elements and to skip the others like accents, accidentals, fingering and ties. The Braille, on the other hand, is formed of 14 characters. Let's look at them one by one. Here is a staccato sign. The staccato sign is followed by the symbol for an accent. This is followed by a symbol for a sharp sign. This is followed by a symbol for the fifth octave. And finally, a note. This note is a C crotchet. This is followed by the symbol for a rhythmic dot, so our C crotchet is in fact a dotted crotchet. This is followed by a fingering sign indicating the second finger. This cell represents the slur. And these two cells represent a tie, followed by another sharp sign. Next comes an interval sign telling us to add a note to the chord a third below the top note. And finally, another fingering. When we see the complexity of the Braille system, perhaps we can understand the reason why many blind people resist learning it. Yet it is still the only system that can represent the most complex pieces of music in a clear and detailed way. There are no other languages or systems that can achieve the same results. Only through reading a score in Braille can the blind reader build a complete mental map of the music. The complexity of music Braille, and the lack of teachers trained in its use, can lead to its being neglected in the musical education of blind students, particularly when they are being educated in mainstream schools. There is a strong temptation for teachers simply to read the students the notes, rather than setting a more gradual approach using Braille music. In recent years, there has been a decline in Braille, not just in music, but also in literary Braille. In the US, this problem is so serious that there is a genuine risk of having a future generation of illiterate blind children. According to an article published in the New York Times, school children in developed countries like the United States and the United Kingdom are expected to have a lower level of Braille literacy than those in developing countries such as Indonesia and Botswana, where they have very few alternatives to the Braille system. Many blind people learn a score by having a teacher, a parent, or a friend read them the notes. Although in some cases the results are reasonable, this method excludes the student from the direct reading of the score that is a prerequisite for the assimilation and internalization of the formal aspects of the music, not to mention the detailed performance directions such as fingering, ties, dynamics, articulation, etc. The blind musician has to use one hand to read the Braille score, and cannot therefore read and perform the music at the same time, except in the case of singers. Blind musicians have to read a fragment, memorize it, and then play it. If they need to re-examine a detail in the score, then they must take their hands off the instrument in order to consult the score. It follows that blind musicians must memorize all the pieces of music that they study. The techniques of memorization vary. The player may read with one hand while playing with the other. This approach is suitable for piano and keyboard instruments. They might read 1 or 2 bars at a time and then try to play them. They might use a recording, possibly a recording of separate parts. They will still, however, need to refer to the Braille score for details that are difficult to be derived from listening, such as fingering. Given the many difficulties of Braille music, is it really worth the trouble of learning it? The answer is yes, because the Braille music notation is the only way to represent the score in all its details. The confirmation of this is the fact that despite these difficulties, thousands of blind people in Europe and throughout the world, thanks to the Braille system, nowadays work as teachers, performers, and composers. Although the importance of Braille music is therefore evident, it's important to underline the fact that it is estimated that the amount of music available in Braille is approximately 1% of what is available to sighted people. Braille music transcriptions are usually made for use within a particular country. There are no networks or systems to rationalize resources by avoiding, for example, the duplication of transcriptions. There are centres of Braille music transcription in various countries, and the material produced is distributed only in embossed paper format. In recent years, production has shifted from the engraving of printing plates to the production of electronic text files for printing with industrial Braille printers. The electronic files produced, however, are created with the sole purpose of printing. The only online library that produces electronic file content is the library braillemusic.eu. that contains over 600 scores in BMML Braille format. So why not visit the website, consult the online catalogue, and register with the library. Thank you for your attention. In part 3 of this video we will talk about the impact of new technology on music Braille.